February 23, 1945. Dawn breaks over the Philippine island of Luzon as 9 C-47 Dakota transport planes roar through the morning sky at dangerously low altitude. Inside the lead aircraft, First Lieutenant John M. Ringler of B Company, 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, stands ready at the open door. Below him, green smoke billows from the drop zone near Los Baños internment camp, where more than 2,000 American civilians have been starving to death for 3 years. At exactly 6:58 a.m., Ringler leaps into the void. His men follow, one every second, their parachutes barely having time to deploy before they hit the ground. This is no ordinary combat jump. They're dropping at just 400 feet, giving them only 25 seconds in the air. Every second counts because somewhere in those bamboo barracks below, American women, children, and elderly civilians are dying while Japanese guards debate whether to execute them all. The story of how these prisoners came to be trapped in this hellish place begins 3 years earlier, when the Japanese war machine swept across the Pacific like a tsunami of steel and fire. December 1941 brought the attack on Pearl Harbor, followed swiftly by the invasion of the Philippines. As American and Filipino forces crumbled under the relentless assault, thousands of American civilians found themselves trapped behind enemy lines. Diplomats, teachers, missionaries, businessmen, and their families were rounded up and herded into makeshift camps. Among them were hundreds of women who would become the forgotten victims of America's darkest hour in the Pacific. Military nurses who had served with distinction, wives of diplomats and military officers, female missionaries who had dedicated their lives to serving Filipino communities, teachers from American schools, and businesswomen who had built lives in the islands. They came from all walks of life, but they shared one terrible fate: capture by an enemy that viewed them as less than human. The Japanese initially scattered these prisoners across multiple camps, but by 1943, they decided to consolidate many of them at a new facility, built on the grounds of the Agricultural College of the Philippines near the small town of Los Baños. The location was chosen deliberately. 40 miles southeast of Manila, surrounded by contaminated water, malaria-infested swamps, and rice paddies that bred disease, it was a place designed to break the human spirit. 800 male internees, selected mostly by lottery, were forced to construct their own prison. They built 26 wooden barracks with nipa palm roofs and walls made of woven sawali mats. Each building measured 30 by 198 feet and housed dozens of prisoners on concrete slabs. The camp was surrounded by a double fence of barbed wire, the outer fence 6 feet tall, the inner 4 feet, with 9 guard posts made of logs and dirt scattered around the perimeter. The first commandant, Major Tanaka, was a man of samurai heritage and Buddhist faith who treated his charges with relative fairness. He even allowed occasional trips to Manila for those who could afford to purchase food. When he was replaced by Major Urabe, conditions remained tolerable, but everything changed in July 1944 when Major T. Iwanaka assumed command. Iwanaka appeared to suffer from what would today be recognized as severe mental illness. He left daily operations to his subordinate, Warrant Officer Sadaki Konishi, a man who seemed to take sadistic pleasure in inflicting suffering on the defenseless prisoners. Under their reign of terror, food rations were slashed, medical supplies were denied, and arbitrary punishments became routine. For the women prisoners, these conditions were particularly devastating. Pregnant women gave birth without medical care. Mothers watched their children waste away from malnutrition. Elderly women died from diseases that could have been easily treated. The female quarters, dubbed Hell's Half-Acre by the prisoners themselves, became a place where hope went to die. By early 1945, the prisoners were consuming fewer than 800 calories per day. Many weighed less than 100 pounds. Their clothes had deteriorated to rags. Lice and bedbugs infested every corner of the camp. The death rate climbed steadily as bodies weakened by years of abuse finally succumbed to disease and starvation. Yet even in their darkest hour, the prisoners clung to hope. American forces had returned to the Philippines in October 1944, and the sound of distant artillery grew closer each day. Navy fighters roared overhead, and bombers passed on their way to Manila. Filipino guerrillas smuggled in food and news when they could. A few prisoners had hidden radios, carefully tuned to Allied broadcasts that spoke of American advances. The intelligence that would ultimately save their lives came through a chance encounter. Major Henry Muller, intelligence officer of the 11th Airborne Division, was interviewing a Filipino plantation owner who had recently traveled across Luzon seeking medicine for his sick wife. During their conversation, the man casually mentioned passing that big POW camp at Los Baños. Muller was stunned. He had no idea so many civilians were being held so close to the fighting. When Muller reported his findings to Lieutenant General Joseph M. Swing, the division commander initially showed little interest. The camp wasn't in their area of operations, he said. But Muller couldn't forget what he'd heard. Quietly, he began gathering intelligence on the camp, its surroundings and its defenses. If the opportunity arose to mount a rescue, the 11th Airborne would be ready. That opportunity came sooner than expected. In January and early February 1945, American forces successfully rescued prisoners from 2 other camps. Rangers and Filipino guerrillas liberated 522 POWs from Cabanatuan in what became known as the Great Raid. Days later, a flying column of the 1st Cavalry Division drove 100 miles in 66 hours to free 3,700 internees from Santo Tomas in Manila. Now attention turned to Los Baños, still deep behind enemy lines with thousands of Japanese troops in the area. The 11th Airborne had fought its way to the southern outskirts of Manila, where they faced the heavily fortified Genco line. It would take weeks of brutal fighting to break through, but intelligence gathering for a rescue operation continued. The breakthrough came when prisoner Freddy Zervulacos made contact with Colonel Gustavo Ingles, a Filipino guerrilla leader. Despite orders from the camp's executive committee not to make contact again, Zervulacos and 3 others, Pete Miles, Jack Connors, and Ben Edwards, snuck out on February 18th and rendezvoused with the guerrillas. Miles was taken across Laguna de Bay in a banca, a traditional outrigger canoe, and the next day arrived at the 11th Airborne's command post. Miles provided crucial intelligence about the camp's defenses, including the location of machine guns and their fields of fire. Most significantly, he revealed that many of the weapons were positioned to fire on the prisoners rather than defend against external attack. This intelligence confirmed the Americans' worst fears about Japanese intentions. The plan that emerged was audacious in its complexity and daring in its execution. 3 separate forces would converge on Los Baños simultaneously. B Company of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment would drop directly onto the camp and eliminate the guards. The 672nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion would cross the lake in 54 LVT-4 Amtraks, carrying 2 rifle companies to evacuate the prisoners. Meanwhile, Task Force Seoul would approach overland from the west as a diversion, drawing Japanese attention away from the rescue. Lieutenant George Skow's reconnaissance platoon would infiltrate the area beforehand, crossing the lake in bancas to mark landing zones and eliminate sentries. Filipino guerrillas from several groups would assist, their local knowledge and burning hatred of the Japanese making them invaluable allies. The timing was critical. Intelligence suggested the Japanese might execute the prisoners at any moment. The attack was scheduled for 7 a.m., when off-duty guards would be doing their morning calisthenics with their weapons locked in the camp armory. It was a narrow window of opportunity that might never come again. On February 19th, B Company was pulled from the front lines and trucked to New Bilibid prison for briefing and preparation. The men's reactions were mixed. While most understood the mission's importance and felt honored to be selected, some thought it was a suicide mission. The company was reinforced with a machine gun platoon, an engineer squad, and 3 Filipino guerrillas who had been adopted during the fighting in Manila. These 3 volunteers received exactly 3 hours of parachute training. Meanwhile, Skow's reconnaissance platoon began its infiltration on the night of February 21st. The first group, led by Skow himself with 3 scouts and 3 war correspondents, set out in bancas for the 3-hour journey across the lake. A second group under Sergeant Martin Squires followed, and a larger banca carrying 23 men and heavy equipment departed 2 hours later. The winds worked against them that night. What should have been a 3-hour crossing took 8 hours for Skow's group and 10 for Squires. They arrived just before sunrise, exhausted but undetected. The large banca carrying the heavy equipment was becalmed in the middle of the lake and didn't arrive until the evening of February 22nd, just hours before the attack. The reconnaissance teams divided into 6 groups, each assigned specific targets. Sergeant Turner would mark the drop zone with green smoke. Sergeant Leonard Hahn would secure the landing beach for the Amtraks. Scow and 3 other sergeants would eliminate guard posts and seize the camp armory. The plan required perfect timing and absolute silence. If they were discovered, the Japanese might begin executing prisoners immediately. As the scouts moved into position through the darkness, Task Force Seoul was also preparing for its diversionary mission. Engineers worked to repair bridges along their route while Filipino guerrillas from the Hunters ROTC group took positions to guard the task force's flanks. The 672nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion assembled on the American side of the lake, their 54 vehicles loaded with 2 companies of infantry. At 4 a.m. on February 23rd, the Amtraks loaded their passengers and moved into the lake. At 5:15 they formed 3 columns of 18 vehicles each and began their 74-minute journey across the dark water. Navigation was by compass and dead reckoning, a risky proposition for crews more accustomed to short trips from ship to shore. As dawn broke, the C-47s carrying B Company appeared overhead, flying so low that the paratroopers in the Amtraks could see the aircraft clearly. Below, Sergeant Turner's team lit green smoke grenades to mark the drop zone, while Sergeant Hahn's group did the same at the landing beach. The Amtraks had navigated almost perfectly, arriving exactly where they needed to be. At 6:58 a.m., Lieutenant Ringler stood in the doorway of the lead aircraft and jumped. His men followed in rapid succession, their parachutes barely having time to deploy before they hit the ground. The low altitude meant they landed close together and could form up quickly for the assault. The reconnaissance teams struck simultaneously. Most of the Japanese guards were indeed at their morning calisthenics, their weapons locked away in the armory. The few sentries on duty were eliminated swiftly and silently. Sergeant Scow's team reached the armory first, cutting down several guards who tried to retrieve their weapons. The attack caught the Japanese completely off guard. Many guards ran around seemingly without direction, some hiding in prisoner barracks, others scrambling into ditches or fleeing toward their own quarters. Filipino guerrillas pursued the fleeing Japanese with bolo knives and machetes, taking brutal revenge for years of occupation and oppression. When the shooting started, most of the internees were assembling for morning roll call. At first, many thought the parachutes were a food drop. It took several minutes for them to realize what was happening. When they did, reactions varied wildly. Some nuns began praying. Others shouted with joy. Many returned to their barracks to gather belongings, while some simply dropped to the ground and lay prone as bullets flew overhead. B Company burst into the camp within 15 minutes of landing. Only one man had been injured during the jump, and that wound wasn't serious enough to stop him from joining his comrades. The Japanese resistance, never truly organized, crumbled rapidly. Most guards were either dead, fleeing, or hiding among the prisoners. The paratroopers were shocked by what they found. The internees appeared to be little more than skin and bones. Many were ill, wearing rags, and some were so frail the soldiers were afraid to touch them for fear of causing injury. The Americans looked like giants compared to the skeletal prisoners, many of whom weighed less than 100 pounds. For the women prisoners, liberation brought a complex mix of emotions. Some cried with relief. Others were euphoric. A few hid or even refused to cooperate, perhaps afraid the Japanese would return. Many were so hungry they ran to the kitchens and storerooms, desperately searching for food. The rumble of approaching Amtraks could be heard from the direction of the lake. Some prisoners became frightened, thinking the noise came from Japanese tanks. Instead, a long column of the strange-looking amphibious vehicles appeared and drove through the main gate. None of the internees had ever seen such machines, but they were overjoyed to see they were American. The 2 infantry companies aboard the Amtraks dismounted and secured the area. A company stayed in the camp while C Company established additional roadblocks. Only 6 Amtraks could fit through the camp entrance, so the rest parked on a baseball field and in open spaces outside the main gate. Major Henry Burgess, the battalion commander in charge of the entire operation, faced a critical problem. The 54 Amtraks could not carry all the prisoners and soldiers in one trip. He would have to send as many as possible in the first lift, while the remaining internees waited under the protection of a paratrooper perimeter at the beach. This was when Lieutenant Ringler encountered the group of hesitant women prisoners. Some were hiding in the barracks, afraid to leave. Others were reluctant to abandon their few remaining possessions. A few were simply too weak to move quickly. Time was running out. The Japanese 8th Infantry Division was only 90 minutes away, and every moment of delay increased the risk of a counterattack. Looking at these skeletal women, some holding babies born in captivity, others barely able to stand, Ringler knew that gentle persuasion was a luxury they couldn't afford. The survival of everyone in the camp depended on a rapid evacuation. With the authority of a man who had just risked his life in an almost impossible mission, he barked the words that would echo through history. "You're coming with us." The task of loading the civilians was made easier when a fire started in the camp headquarters building. Burgess ordered his men to set fire to additional barracks to force the prisoners away from their quarters and toward the waiting Amtraks. This had the desired effect, and soon paratroopers were helping the frail civilians aboard the vehicles. The first convoy departed at 11 a.m., carrying 1,500 of the weakest prisoners, including most of the women and children. Paratroopers marched alongside the Amtraks, providing security as they headed toward the lakeshore. Along the route, Filipino villagers gathered to pass water and bananas to their liberators and the freed Americans. At the beach, the remaining paratroopers formed a defensive perimeter while the Amtraks crossed the lake. Japanese artillery from Mandan Point and the rock quarry opened fire, but the American vehicles were well protected and suffered no serious damage. The round trip would take at least 2 hours, leaving the remaining prisoners and their guards vulnerable to counterattack. General Swing flew overhead in an L-4 liaison aircraft and established radio contact with Major Burgess. The division commander was pleased that the operation had gone so well with so few casualties. He suggested that once the last internees were evacuated, Burgess should take his remaining troops and link up with Task Force Seoul. Burgess realized this was a terrible idea and did the only thing he could to avoid being ordered to do it. He turned off his radio. Just after 1 p.m., the Amtraks returned for the second lift. The remaining civilians and paratroopers were loaded aboard, including the artillerymen with their 75mm pack howitzers. One gun crew, frustrated by Japanese fire from Mandan Point, aimed their weapon at the enemy position and fired. The recoil nearly swamped their Amtrak, and the angry driver threatened to shoot them if they tried to fire again. Task Force Seoul had successfully drawn Japanese attention away from the rescue operation. The diversionary force engaged enemy positions in the nearby hills and at the rock quarry, making enough noise to convince the Japanese that this was the main attack. When Seoul saw the prisoners being evacuated across the lake, he began withdrawing to the San Juan River, having accomplished his mission. By 4 p.m., all 2,147 civilians were safely across the lake and being transported to New Bilibid prison. The former prisoners were taken aback to be quartered in prison cells, but it was nevertheless a joyous occasion. Doctors and medics examined the civilians while new clothing was distributed. A chow line was opened, and some went through it 4 times, their shrunken stomachs struggling to process real food after years of starvation rations. The meal consisted of fresh bread with butter and bean soup, chosen specifically to be gentle on their sensitive digestive systems. Newsmen walked among them, taking photographs, conducting interviews, and filming the historic occasion. When the second group arrived safely, the rescued paratroopers were reunited with the people they had saved, sharing a meal together before the soldiers returned to war. The human cost of the rescue became apparent in the days that followed. The Japanese, enraged by their humiliation, massacred 1,500 Filipino civilians in reprisal for the raid. It was a reminder that liberation often came at a terrible price for those left behind. Among the rescued women were the surviving members of the Angels of Bataan, military nurses who had endured 3 years of captivity after the fall of the Philippines. Their stories of courage under impossible conditions would inspire a generation of Americans. Many of these women had continued to provide medical care to fellow prisoners, even while starving themselves. The psychological impact of sudden liberation after years of captivity was profound. Some women struggled to believe they were truly free. Others found it difficult to trust their rescuers after years of brutality. The transition from despair to hope was not always smooth, but the human spirit proved remarkably resilient. Warrant Officer Sadaki Konishi, the cruel overseer who had tormented the prisoners daily, was captured months later and hanged in 1947 for war crimes. Major Iwanaka, the demented commandant, managed to escape and was never brought to justice. The contrast between American mercy and Japanese brutality could not have been starker. B Company received a Distinguished Unit Citation for its role in the rescue, one of the most successful prisoner liberation operations in military history. The Los Baños raid demonstrated that with careful planning, precise execution, and extraordinary courage, even the most impossible missions could succeed. The campsite is now part of the University of the Philippines, its grounds transformed into a peaceful park. A massive rain tree called the Fertility Tree stands where the barracks once housed starving prisoners, and young couples now meet beneath its branches. It serves as a living memorial to those who suffered and died there, and to those who risked everything to set them free. The women of Los Baños carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Some became advocates for prisoners of war. Others dedicated themselves to ensuring such atrocities would never be forgotten. Their stories remind us that in humanity's darkest hours, courage and compassion can still triumph over cruelty and despair. The words, "You're coming with us," became more than a command that February morning. They were a promise that America would never abandon its own, no matter how desperate the circumstances or how dangerous the mission. In a war filled with unimaginable horrors, the rescue at Los Baños stands as proof that sometimes, against all odds, the good guys really do win. Thank you for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel to stay updated with our latest content. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us grow and continue bringing you great content.